And now, from the Room 111 studios, it's Hacking Engagement with James Sternovich.
Hey there, listener. Welcome back to the Hacking Engagement podcast. I'm so glad you're here. The bubblefication of the United States. Bubblefication. The bubblefication. Before I typed that word, before I said that word, I actually had to look it up and see if anyone's using it. And there are. So this term, bubblefication, this ridiculous made-up term, and the fact that it's so easily searchable shows you that the bubblefication of America is real. So this bubblefication is much written about and much talked about. We tend to live around, interact with, watch media outlets populated by and are entertained by people who think like we do, and unfortunately they probably look like we do. That's too bad, because while bubbles can feel safe, they're also limiting. The scary part of our bubbles is that they are reflected in our schools. Many American students learn in monochromatic settings. Their peers largely look like they do and probably think like they do as well. Youth should be a time of healthy exploration. So what can be done? Today I'm going to talk to David McCullough. He has an interesting idea on how to get students at your school out of their bubbles. His creation, the American Exchange Project, offers 10 to 14-day summer experiences for graduating seniors. It's like a mini gap year. Students will live and experience, for a brief time, a community that's different than their own. Now, please listen to this. This experience is free, and it's open to all. I was drawn to this program because I understand the power of experiences. When I think back on formative elements in my life, I usually focus on powerful experiences. Some of these events were brief, some were long, some were free, while others came at a price. Regardless of whether these experiences were positive or negative, I grew as a result. David is a positive experience creating catalyst for contemporary American youth. Think of students at your school who could benefit from such a program. I bet you can compile a long list. So I think this episode has great potential. I mean, think about a kid at your school that would thrive with such an opportunity. Buckle up, man. This one's important. Here's my elevator pitch for my brand new book, Teaching in Magenta. This book provides 100 ways to create a magnificent day in your classroom. Once you start stringing some magenta days together, you and your students will experience profound well-being and deep joy. That's Teaching in Magenta, which is now available on Amazon's virtual shelves. So here we are in the Room 111 studios, and this time of year in the state of Ohio is damn near magical. Everything is just exploding. And I'm going to talk to somebody who isn't from the state of Ohio. His name is David McCullough. Say hello, David.
Hey, James. How are you? Hi, everyone.
And I looked on WeatherBug this morning, and you guys are going to be like 50s, kind of cloudy today, right?
We call that balmy out here. I'm getting my sunscreen out, actually, James. That's
and you're in Boston, right?
I'm in Boston. I'm in the suburbs of Boston, and we're every year, the weather in mid-April, it sort of fakes left and then it goes right again, where it gives you a week of about sunny and 75, gets your hopes up, and then the clouds roll in and sort of 48 to 57 sets in. So we're in the middle of that week right now.
Well, you know,
whatever you got, send it our way is what I'm saying.
Hey, well, I've often thought that it would be really hard to play in the month of April for the Boston Red Sox.
Yeah.
Have you been to a Red Sox game in April?
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, I grew up playing baseball, and I played college baseball in the Northeast too, and however unfun April is, March is worse.
Oh, yeah, that should be outlawed. I cannot believe college teams do that.
Yeah, well, you have to because you got to keep pace with the teams in the South, and so practice was outdoors as of February 1st. So.
That's just brutal, man. So if you go down south and play, and you went to Harvard?
Yale.
Yale?
Oh, come
Okay.
on. Yeah, my goodness.
And so those guys from Florida and Georgia, they're looking at you going, those guys aren't as good a baseball players as they be down here, right?
And we often prove them right, James. We often prove them right.
So we're going to talk about this magnificent program called the American Exchange Project that David has created. But before we can do that, we have to talk a little bit about his formative years and how that might relate to what he's done. So tell us about you. Where'd you grow up? Like, what was your childhood like? Give us a lowdown, man.
My childhood was bliss to the definition. I grew up on the campus of the Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
My dad, when he was about my age in his late 20s, was sick with bronchitis in Boston, got a call from his best pal from college who was stationed at Pearl Harbor in the Navy and said, why don't you come out to visit? And after 24 hours in Honolulu, my dad was calling around looking for a job, and a 2-week vacation turned into 16 years. And my mom moved out with him the year later, and one day she woke up and thought she had an ulcer, and they went to the hospital, and it turned out it was me. And so 9 months after the fake ulcer, I came along, and
the real
we spent
ulcer, right?
Years on the campus of Punahou School, and it was, in its way, I of course didn't think of this at the time, but in its way, it was a great place to grow up because when you're on the campus of a school, especially in a place like Hawaii, which is probably the most diverse state in the country.
That's right.
There really is no racial majority there.
Mm-hmm.
You're exposed to diversity of every kind, and when you're growing up in that environment, and I've always been a chatterbox, you're learning to socialize and learn from and hang out with and have fun with people from all walks of life. And so it was this great and terrific and enriching environment to grow up in. And then when I was in the first grade, about 7 years old, the school got a donation to build a middle school, and they had nowhere to put faculty housing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the catalyst to get my parents to do what they had long wanted to do, which was move back east where they're from, back to Boston. And so I grew up here in the suburbs of Boston in a little town called Sudbury. It's a quiet, bucolic, white-collar, very liberal-leaning suburb of Boston. Dad continued to teach. Mom helps run her family's jewelry business. Went off to prep school for a year, went through the public schools here in Sudbury. Then I went to Phillips Andover for a year,
Mm-hmm.
and then after that Yale, and then after that Cambridge. And that was my education. And after Cambridge, I started AEP. That
is quite an education. That is a gold-plated education, sir, and I think that you probably are aware of that. Now,
Right.
I'm gonna blow you away a little bit because my father was a history professor.
Mm-hmm.
And history professors are allowed to go on sabbaticals. In fact, they're encouraged to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was a 15-year-old, sophomore in high school, I spent 1 year at the University of Hawaii with my father, and I went to a place which you may have heard of called Kaimuki High School, which is an urban high school.
Yeah.
It was not diverse, and I was like the minority by a long shot.
Yeah.
And I was kind of a little guy, still am, And I was walking around with all these Samoans and thinking, man, I'm not in Kansas anymore. But I will say that this leads into what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
That experience as a high school student, being a minority, like a distinct minority, a haole, just like a white sheet of paper. Very obvious. That had a magnificent impact on me. And at times it wasn't fun. I mean, there were times that year where I was not having a good time and was, scared and all that stuff. But looking back on that, I taught for a number of years. It gave me tremendous empathy for students who might feel like they didn't necessarily fit into the bubble. We're going to talk about bubbles today.
Yeah.
Where they were situated.
Yeah.
So that experience as a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old was hugely impactful for me.
I think that's a tremendously astute point, and I think it really shows, it touches on something that I think is so important and is a question in the forefront of every kid's mind, one they don't even realize they're asking, which is, do I fit in?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I fit in?
Right.
If you think about so much of growing up, you're not really constructing your own identity. You're kind of looking around at what are the identities out there and figuring out which one do I fit into, which one feels right to me, and then also who accepts me. When working with kids, there's this constant need for affirmation. Do you like me?
Sure.
Do you accept me? Do you see who I am? And we all, the contexts we grow up in shape who we are, both in a kind of meta way, but also day to day. If we went up the road to Lincoln Sudbury High School and you went and saw most of the ninth grade girls there, all of them would be wearing hoodless sweaters, probably gray or white, black, leggings and white sneakers, probably. Yeah. There's a reason for that. That's not coincidence. That's very intentional. And that's kids trying to fit in. That's
Sure.
Kids trying to construct identity. And that slowly becomes who we are. And I think it shapes our psychology in some way, which, again, ties back to the bubbles we're going to talk about today. Yeah.
Well, just to reinforce what you said, which is really interesting, is by nature I'm an extroverted person.
Mm-hmm.
In that school, I was not.
Yeah.
I tried to not draw attention to myself. I wanted to keep a very low profile, partly because, I didn't want to get hassled, but also because I just wasn't comfortable doing that. But I look back on that, and it's one of the most valuable experiences of my life, even though at the time it was stressful. And even though at the time I was concerned, about getting messed with and all that. That's astute. And I think that happens to young people a lot when they're in situations like I taught in a school that was not very diverse. It was about 92% white. And, the minority students that went through our school often said one of their desires was just to fit in.
Yeah.
And a lot of times fitting in meant doing things that they didn't necessarily feel were their default or didn't necessarily feel was natural for them. So it's so stressful. It's very stressful.
We had a program like that in my own high school, the Medco program, which bused kids from Boston out to the suburbs. And I think it's how do you fit in at home, and then how do you fit in out here, and
no kidding.
Look at the differences.
No kidding, man. Okay, so you obviously, it shows through in the brief period of time that we've been talking. You're passionate about young people. Why? Why are you passionate about young people?
I think often of the George Carlin line, when he said, kids are our future, but he says, when kids grow up, they're not the future, they're the present, so kids can't be the future. Yeah. No, I'm passionate about I'm really passionate about this country and American democracy. I think our Constitution and I think our democracy is the best answer to the age-old question, how do we all live together? That is kind of the fundamental question in any society. And one thing I see is that when working with young people, they have a great power to bring about change, and they have a great power to inspire folks. And it's very important to me that young people all have equal opportunity in this society, and I think that they don't right now.
No.
I think that a great show of the success of any society is how well it raises its young people and the values that those young people grow up with. And I think we're falling short of that in our culture at large. When we started what became the American Exchange Project, initially, when I say we with some of my co-founders, I'm including some of my co-founders here, we had not planned to work with young people. I grew up the son of an English teacher who was my father and my best pal. And so teaching and working with young people and the life of books and knowledge and high thought for me was always the gold standard.
Sure.
And so we came around to working with young people when we realized that, to help fix American democracy, it's actually young people who are the best sort of foot soldiers to do this and not adults. And also, if you think about most adults, they're introduced to new ideas through their children. And so if you're trying to shape the world of adults, it's actually a great move to work with young people.
Yeah.
So that doesn't totally answer, I work with young people, one, because it's a decisive strategic move for our organization to work with young people with our, in terms of the objective we're trying to achieve. I also like working with young people because I believe in fairness. And I think one of the greatest shows of fairness is the equality of opportunity that are introduced to young people born into any society.
Okay. And so you look at America today, and those opportunities are those kids at Sudbury. Is that what you were saying?
Sudbury, yeah.
They got all kinds of opportunities.
Yeah.
All kinds of opportunities. I taught in a school like that. And you and I spoke before, and you could drive 14 miles south of our school and be on a different planet. That's not helping this country.
No. When you look at statistics like the fact that wealthy children are 17 times likelier to go to college than kids born in the bottom 20% of American incomes. When you look at statistics like 1 in 5 American children are born into poverty, that's something like 800,000 kids. And over 90% of kids born into poverty will remain in poverty for the rest of their lives. That doesn't, to me, suggest that the rungs on the socioeconomic ladder are as close as they need to be. We have a class-based society in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways that we don't like to admit as American citizens. And
that's important, what you just said.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that a lot of Americans don't want to acknowledge. You're right. I agree with you. Now, let's go a little further with this, talking about kids and talking about your background. In reading your website, it became apparent that you had a Jack Kerouac-like experience. Now, Jack Kerouac, for anybody that doesn't know, famous American writer, just on the road, right? Just hit the road and just kind of saw the country as a young person, kind of like a gap year, I guess you could call it.
Yeah.
You had an experience like that.
I did. I behaved a little better than he did.
That's good.
Tying back to the Hawaii, I've long loved adventure in books. When I was a kid, I used to fall asleep on the National Geographic atlases, dreaming of sailing a boat to Tahiti or hiking the mountains and in the north of Spain, or going and hacking through the jungles of Ethiopia. I mean, I loved adventure. Adventure for me was just the coolest thing. And in my imagination, I was a big imagination kid. And when I was 8 years old, we moved back from Hawaii to Boston, and my parents shipped the car back to Los Angeles.
Great. Oh,
and
great.
Yeah,
great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Put it in a container, shipped it to LA. We needed to get the car from LA to Boston, and my whole family and I, we drove across the country. It was from LA to we drove with my pregnant mother, my sister, and my brother, who were very little at the time, from LA to Denver. And by the time the three of them got to Denver, pregnant mom, little kid Leah, little kid Ethan, they'd had enough. They couldn't take it anymore. So we put them on a plane and flew them to Boston. And Dad and I began a Ballparks of America tour.
Oh, weren't you glad to get rid of those people so you guys could have some fun?
Right. 8-year-old me, and, best pal Dad, in the little Volvo that we'd had since I was born. We still have it to this day. My brother drives it to high school. Hauling across the country.
That's awesome.
On a big. It was just a great pivot moment in my life, and it was just kind of this sort of golden memory up on the shelf of memories that I have in my head. And so fast forward to college, I'm a junior at Yale, and I just had gotten into a program which offered a fellowship to do a research project on really whatever you wanted in the summer after the program began. This program ran from this junior spring to senior fall. And I thought, well, if I had free money, the one thing I'd want to do with it for fun is an American road trip. And I'm sure it's that experience with my dad that really created that impulse in me. And then with all the things I was researching and interested in, and growing up, my best friend in high school was a kid who grew up in inner city Boston, a Dominican immigrant, Jesse Valdez. We played baseball together in the summer, and Jesse had gone to the public schools in Boston and had the very different public school experience than I'd had here in the suburbs. And that was curious to me. So with this research project to do whatever I wanted, immediately I paired together an interest in the issues that poverty and just sort of abandonment had presented to education with this idea of a road trip. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to drive across the country and I'm going to go look at how poverty influences schools in different types of American communities. And so I borrowed my mom's car and hit the road. and I drove from Sudbury to Cotulla, Texas, which is a small town down in South Texas, about 60 miles north of Laredo. And they were caught in the middle of the bust after one of the largest oil booms in South Texas history. Mm-hmm. The population of the town went from 3,000 up to 13,000, back to 3,000 again. The taxable value of the land that the school had went from $450 million a year to over $7 billion a year. And interestingly, as the funding for the schools went up, the test scores didn't really change. I thought that was a very interesting bit of research. Anyway,
yes.
After Cotulla, I drove north to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. I was there for 3 weeks. And then after Pine Ridge, I went to some of the more blighted neighborhoods around Cleveland, Huff and Slavic Village.
Yeah.
And after that, I went back and I kind of concluded my research in New Haven. So I saw big city, small town, and then this area that's really like nowhere else, which was the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And I learned a ton. And I made really great friends, which was an unlikely thing to me moving into it, given the fact that I was a white kid from privilege, from an Ivy League institution at a time of great division. Now, the other interesting element to that trip was that it was the summer of 2016. And so while I was driving around the country, the Trump campaign was also going around the country, exposing how divided our country was. You know, half the country thought this guy was a great idea. Half the country thought he was the worst thing that had ever happened to American politics. How could that be? Mm-hmm. And as I was driving around, I realized, we're not surprised that Donald Trump is the president. What's really shocking, and what should be shocking us, is how disparate the circumstances in which we all live have become, so that Americans can actually believe, half of us can actually believe this guy's a great idea, half of us can actually think that he's the worst thing that ever happened. That's how far apart we're living right now.
That's right.
And then when he won, and I was back at Yale, and everyone at Yale was so surprised as to why Donald Trump was the president, I was thinking, well, come and hop in my mom's car, and I'll show.
That's right.
And it's because so much of America feels forgotten and left out and left behind. It's a time of it's kind of a national tale of two cities in a lot of ways. And I'm stealing that from a pastor I know pretty well in Cleveland who described Cleveland as this tale of two cities. Right?
It is, yeah.
Nationally. And so I was wondering what to do about that, and that experience was really the beginning of what founded AEP.
Awesome, man. So that's a perfect segue to the next question. So I want you to picture the typical listener to this podcast, which is a K-12 public educator. Mm-hmm. Most are pretty overwhelmed with all the things that they have to care about, but one thing I know is that my listeners care deeply about kids. Mm-hmm. Before we describe your organization, what it does and how it does it, give those teachers an elevator pitch. Why should they continue listening to a podcast talking about the American Exchange Project?
I think, ironically, kids learn the most from their experiences.
Yeah.
Here I am, as educated as a person can be.
Right.
And I can't remember much about the lectures I spent hours in doing my master's degree at Cambridge. Mm-hmm. But I can remember that I ordered pancakes and a chocolate milk at the Denny's in Ohio when I was 8 years old, where I left my Boston Red Sox hat. Dad and I pulled in. I've learned the most from my friendships, from my experiences. I thought when I was this is not much of an elevator pitch, and what AEP is doing, basically, is providing kids with a deeply enriching experience in an environment that's totally different from the one that they've grown up in.
That's perfect. Now explain how it works.
Essentially, it's a national domestic exchange program, the same way a foreign exchange program works, but instead of studying abroad in France, you're studying abroad in Iowa or Massachusetts or California.
Right.
Basically, it's for seniors. It's free. Kids register between September 1st and January 1st.
Right.
They put down preferences of where they want to go, and they can see on our website all of the communities that we've partnered with and all of the events we're offering. What AEP does, we go to communities, we meet with community leaders, and we say, what should kids do when they come here? The communities define the experience. Uh-huh. And more often than not, they pick one big event in the summer that kids should come and staff. And so maybe they come and work at the agricultural fair on Martha's Vineyard, or they go and work the dip net salmon fishing competition in Kenai, Alaska, or the rodeo in Cody.
So let me just ask you this question. So they're part of the program. The program is free, and then they are volunteering at these events.
That's if that's what the community says, there is to do in town. If we meet with community leaders and they think, well, there's nothing like that here in the summer, let's think of 6 other things that kids can do along the lines of cultural immersion and professional development.
Okay.
And so we pair the kids with a town, with a host family.
Okay.
And then they'll hear about where they're going on March 1st of their senior year, and then they'll be in a virtual hangout group through AEP's portal with all the kids that they're traveling with.
Yeah.
Through the senior spring, and then in the summer, off they go.
Now, David, is the expectation that if you send someone, you're going to get someone back?
The hope that we would ask that every family who does it hosts, but if you can't host a kid, that's fine. We find all housing situations for all our kids. So the fun of it is you get kind of 2 experiences. You're traveling with kids from all over the United States. So you get to know kids from all over the U.S. and the communities they come from. Mm-hmm. You're traveling to a place that's very different from the one you've grown up in. And so you get to know deeply a town that's very different from the one that raised you.
Yeah.
You host a kid from a different community. And so you get to know really well the community that kid came from because of the just sort of natural osmosis that happens when 2 people come together. And then on top of that, you have kids from all over the United States coming to your town as well. And so it's this chance for kids to be exposed to the way people are living in all over the country while also getting to know deeply and well a place that's really different from their own and have the chance to make friendships with Americans who have grown up in totally different environments. So what we're trying to do is really make a more connected American society through a program that is this National Domestic Exchange Program.
So that would be my next question. Your goals for this program is exactly that. Trying to make and to do that, you have to get people, as you say on the website, out of their bubbles.
Right.
Because I'm in one, you're in one, or we're all in one. It's comfortable in the bubble. I mean, it's darn comfortable. Yeah. And the world makes sense in your bubble.
Right.
But your perspective might be skewed.
And that's the great metaphor of the bubble, right? You can grow up in a bubble, but you won't grow very tall, and you won't travel very far. That's problematic. And I think over the long haul, we begin to sense our own limitations. Mm-hmm. And the bubbles we live in are limiting us. They are limiting our perspectives. They're limiting our views on society. And they're really creating in a lot of Americans tribalistic behavior.
That's a good way to put that. Yes.
And that's hugely problematic given, the kind of social contract we've all signed by being an American in a democracy. We got to care about one another. Yeah. We have to understand one another. We vote on the laws that affect everybody. The dollars we spend in the economy circulate. We need to think about these things. These are civic choices that we're making when we vote, when we spend money in the economy, when we espouse our opinions on social media. We need to think about these things, these decisions that we make, and I think we need to be more connected to our country. That way we can have some measure of consciousness about how we're affecting the lives of other Americans. Okay. And I don't think most Americans are doing a very good job of that.
No, I agree with you on that. Now, I'm going to talk about obstacles in just a second, but I'm going to throw another obstacle on you that you guys have obviously contended with COVID. Like the program's probably just been put on hold.
Yeah.
When do you hope to be ramped up back to normal?
So COVID in a way has been a blessing in disguise is a wrong way to say it, but COVID has given us the chance to when we go travel around and talk about this program, it's plain that it's really popular with a wide variety of people, really everybody. And COVID has given us the chance to create a program that can scale to a really high level while maintaining some measure of quality for the experience. We all know in the education community that quantity and quality, work adversely of each other. More kids in the classroom, the harder it is to give every kid a great experience. Sure. What we've been able to do is figure out how we can create a high-quality program for lots and lots of American kids. So we're going to launch that program on September 1st, and our first big trip is going to happen in the summer of 2022.
Perfect. And hopefully by then, people will be living normal lives again. Here's an obstacle that I see. I grew up in Appalachia. I live in a prosperous place, which is central Ohio, but it's surrounded by areas that are really struggling. And I grew up, and I'll be quite frank with you, I was looking for greener pastures. Mm-hmm. I wanted to graduate and move on.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened in a lot of places that are blighted in this country.
Yeah.
So in advertising this to teachers from those areas, mm-hmm. the one thing that's a concern is talented young people don't want to stay.
Right.
They don't want to stay in these areas. They want to get out. And I think, obviously, there's some merit to that thought.
Sure.
And I could see local business leaders being reluctant.
Yeah.
But what's the point of education? I mean, it's to broaden horizons. And
right.
and I know you're reluctant, but here's an opportunity for you to
right.
show what you have.
Right.
How have you navigated that?
Right. This is the how do you get them back on the farm after they've seen
Great reference.
We call it cherry picking, and it's one of our chief concerns. First off, too late. Pick up your phone if you're a kid growing up in any town today, and the world is right there. I mean, you can through video and social media travel the globe, and so kids now know what the lights of Perry look like through a screen.
Right.
And that's an unfair and kind of tainted impression. So the world is already there all of a sudden, and that's difficult. That's a difficult thing to handle and rationalize. The short answer to your question, James, is I don't really know. But my feeling is that the vast majority of Americans are really proud about the towns that they come from.
Okay.
And on top of that, one thing that we see in traveling the country is that one common response we get, whether we're in Manhattan or small town Oklahoma, is, great, we want to do it, but why in the world would anyone want to come here?
Right.
And that's a reaction from an 18-year-old who's really sort of tired about where they're growing up, and they can't wait to fly the coop. And what happens is the first place that they land when they leave the coop is the coolest place in the world, whether that's Youngstown, Ohio, or San Francisco, California. And you're talking to a guy who kind of did that. I mean, I'd spent my life playing baseball. Combination of no talent and a shoulder injury stopped. And then the first summer I spent not playing baseball in over a decade, I did this road trip. And I founded AEP because I think that this is something that can really help improve the lives of the folks that I came to care about in the communities I fell in love with back in the summer of 2016. Towns that couldn't be more different from the one I grew up in. So I'm hoping that what will happen with AEP, and my conviction is that this will happen, is that it'll take kids from the sorts of communities that you're talking about. It'll expose them to a wider society, and then they'll be able to go back. Because no matter where you go, you're still who you are, and you're still the person that comes from where you come from. And you can be, you can be a Catulan from Cotulla, Texas, walking around the streets of Paris, soaking in all that there is to know and making all the connections that one would want to make and gaining all the knowledge that one could make from Paris, and then come back and bring that to Cotulla. Mm-hmm. And that's fantastic. I learned this going to graduate school in another country. Ironically, when you travel abroad, the place you learn the most about is your own. The country you learn the most about is your own.
That's a
when
great response.
When you go to a very different American town, ironically, the one you learn the most about is the one that you come from. Mm-hmm. And I think for most people who are really proud of their towns, even towns caught on hard times, they're going to learn a lot about what they can do to bring those towns out of hard times, what it needs to, what it takes to get a town and a community back up on its feet again. I think often of that small town in Texas I was in, where I knew a group of wonderful people who went off to college and then went back to Cotulla and are working hard to revitalize Cotulla's Main Street, who are working hard to revitalize Cotulla's public spaces and have plans in the works to make a beautiful little South Texas town. And I think that's terrific. That's item one. Item two is I think kids who come from big city suburbs, which don't really have that kind of palpable Main Street identity that a lot of American communities have.
That's right.
Are going to fall in love with these places.
That's right.
And there is a long list of opportunities available to people, in college and after college, to go and help and live and teach and work in towns that are in the sorts of towns that are really caught on hard times, the sorts of towns that people are trying to get out of. And I'd love to make available to our kids who go to these downtrodden places and fall in love. Mm-hmm. All of these opportunities after AEP to say, great, stay involved. You care about it. Start working on it. Roll up your sleeves and start working on it. And so I'm hoping we create that kind of culture through the program. And my conviction is that we will. I've seen it in small ways through our virtual program. And I've seen it, I think we'll continue to see it this summer when our first kids travel.
And I like your answer. I think it's a solid answer. And I'm going to say that there's nothing wrong with a student like getting exposure to something outside of their bubble and then saying, oh, I want that.
Right.
And going and curing cancer and going and developing electric cars that can drive themselves. I mean,
right.
Don't feel bad if a student leaves your small town and goes and does something magnificent.
Right.
And maybe that might have been inspired by a weekend or a couple weeks in the American Exchange Project. I mean, hallelujah.
And as I said, I think we're all we cannot change where we're from. We'll always be who we are and where we're from. I think of my grandfather often. Granted, Pittsburgh isn't a small town, but he hasn't lived in Pittsburgh since he was 18 years old. But he is a Pittsburgh guy through and through to this day at 88 years old. And
that's awesome.
And there's something about that. There's something about that local pride that I think really resonates.
So he's got those weird Pittsburgh sayings like "Yins guys" and that stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah. He still roots for the Pittsburgh Pirates.
That ain't easy. Okay, now let's just sum things up. This is free.
Yeah.
2 weeks?
10 days to 2 weeks. As I said, it's the town that curates the exchange, so we let them pick how long it's going to be.
Okay.
10 days.
So it's free. It's 2 weeks long. You put down preferences, but you get placed.
Mm-hmm.
It is for high school graduates primarily.
Yes.
Okay. They go through a application process, selection process.
No, it's a registration process. Our promise is to make it free for every kid and to never reject a student. We realize that if we create barriers to entry in a program like this, we're in the long run going to exacerbate the problem we're trying to fix.
Perfect, man. I'm so glad that was emphasized. Yeah. Now, my audience, how can they help?
Right now, what we really need is connections.
Sure.
We need connections to schools and to kids. Our goal is to make this a big national program one day. Mm-hmm. With, we think that this ought to be something that every American should do.
Right. Right.
And so we need to get off the block with a really wide spread of communities, with a vast array of communities of many different types, kinds, places, populations. And so what your listeners can do is send us an email if they're interested. Mm-hmm. And we'll come along and meet and chat and talk about how we can get that school, that town on board with AEP.
Perfect.
We're getting the word out right now. We're networking. And we're going to launch this on September 1st, and we need to get off the block with as wide a spread of communities as possible.
Great. And so they can learn more by going to your website, which I'll link on my show notes, but some people don't go to show notes, man. Tell them your website.
www.americanexchangeproject.org.
Wow. Powerful message, my friend.
Thank you.
I think it's so important to do things like this when you're young and have the ability to do it. Right now, I'm getting ready for my daughter's wedding. I got grandkids. I'd love to go somewhere for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And escape all those responsibilities, and just kind of live and learn. But when you're 18 years old, by gosh, take advantage, man. Take advantage, and you can't beat the price, brother.
Yeah, it creates a heavy lift for us on staff, but it's all worth it. I often think of my 8th grade teacher, Mary Mahoney, who came up to me in the middle of class and said, "David, it's not what you know, it's who." And I thought that was a really interesting thing for a teacher to say.
Yeah.
And I think she's right. And really what AEP is trying to do is expose kids to more people, more Americans, more places.
I have to tell you this story. It's sure. Terrible, and it doesn't reflect well on educators, but I'm going to tell it anyway because it inspired me by that. I was in a class one time, and we had a real smart aleck kid in there.
Yeah.
And a teacher said something along those lines, like something inspirational. He goes, "Wow." And in your case, you're still teaching at this high school. So it really took the wind out of their sails. I'm sorry. I had to share that, man. Hey, listen, I hope you guys have a nicer weekend than Thursday. And I think the Red Sox, they have... I don't know. They must have Major League Baseball feeling sorry for them, so they let them play a lot of away games in April, and then they have
air right now. It's amazing.
And then they're going to have all these home games in September to make up for it when the weather in Massachusetts is gorgeous. Wonderful.
Yeah, I know. And the Sox are on a tear right now. I think we've won 7 or 8 in a row. So
that's awesome. And my favorite Red Sox book, you probably read it, is The Summer of '49.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read that book?
A long time ago.
I love that book. Love that book. All right, my friend. Look, you have a great day. I appreciate you coming on. I want to wish your program good luck. I think you're doing good work.
James, thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
So here we are at the What You Can Do Tomorrow section, and it's short and sweet today. The problem is that American students learn in bubbles, and the solution is to create opportunities for students to experience life in a different community. Now, what I'd like you to do tomorrow is make certain to visit the American Exchange Project website. There's a link on the show notes. And just scout around. Read the different pages. Read the About Us section. It's helpful. It'll motivate you. And then finally, I want you to share this idea. You can share the podcast. You can share the website. But share this idea with important people at your school, administrators, guidance counselors, people who would have access to share this information with parents and students. I want you to become a positive experience creating catalyst for a contemporary American youth just like David McCullough. And good luck tomorrow engaging your kids.
Show notes for this episode can be found at jamesalansturdivant.com. If you enjoy Hacking Engagement, please subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes.